it is basically just a lot of dark, gruesome fun.
Meet Yura. She's a doctor. Yura and her twin brother Yuri are traveling together, but he got impatient with her slow mule and went to scout ahead. That's where he met this gentleman, who demanded money from Yuri for crossing a bridge. Yuri took exception to the idea and a fight broke out, during which both were injured. After the initial confrontation, and several rounds of combat, the GM rules Yura and her mule come around the bend and spot Yuri and the bandit locked in a fight. The GM asks Yura's player to roll initiative so she can join in the combat during the next round. It's a low roll, so she'll be going last. In combat, time is measured in two ways. A turn is the length of time it takes a single character to make a movement, perform their regular action, and perform an extra action. A round is the length of time it takes every character involved in the combat to perform their turns. Occasionally, a single action, such as casting a ritual or performing surgery, may take multiple rounds to perform. In those cases, once the action has begun, a character must dedicate their subsequent turns to continuing their action until it is finished. If they fail, or they stop performing the action is ended and the end result is not achieved. While performing an action like this, the character cannot make a movement or perform other actions during that time. Measuring time in turns and rounds generally only happens when characters are in combat, though the GM may break time down into rounds during particularly intense non-combat scenes where each second counts. The fight continues. Yuri and the bandit both succeed at attacks, and their health points are chipped away. Then it is Yura's turn, and she decides to shoot the bandit with her crossbow. This is a range attack check, and those work a little bit differently than the melee attacks we've already covered. Range attack checks involve attacking from a distance, either using a weapon like a bow or a crossbow, or a thrown weapon like a throwing dagger. A range attack check is resolved by rolling 1d10, adding dexterity, adding the appropriate skill, adding or subtracting any modifiers, and comparing it against the target's defense action check. As with a melee attack, a range attack check must be higher than the defense action check in order to succeed. Being less than or equal to the defense action check means the attack failed. Range attack checks can be modified depending on how far away you are from the target. All ranged weapons have a listed attack range. At less than 1/4 your weapon's listed range, you're at close range, and there's no modifier. Between 1/4 and 1/2 of a weapon's listed target range, you are at medium range, and subtract 2 from your attack check. Between 1/2 and a weapon's listed range is long range, which has a penalty of -4. Between a weapon's listed range and 2 times its listed range is extreme range, which subtracts 6 from your attack check. When you are within half a meter of a target, you can receive a bonus known as a point-blank modifier. This gives you a +5 on your range attack check, but is usually only applied by the GM when your enemy is somehow immobilized and utterly incapable of defending themselves. A bow or crossbow cannot be fired more than once per action. A bow can be fired using a strong strike, but a crossbow cannot. Dodge and reposition defense actions can be performed against range attacks as normal. Block defense actions can only be used against range attacks if the defender is wielding a shield. Parry defense actions can't be used against bow and crossbow attacks, but can be used against thrown weapons at a -5 penalty. When making a range attack check against an inanimate object, you roll against a static DC instead of against a defense action check. The DC depends on the object's distance from you and its size, and can be determined using the charts on page 164 of the rulebook. The damage bonus a character receives for having a high body is added to the damage of non-exploding thrown weapons, but not to the damage of bows or crossbows. Drawing an arrow from your quiver and nocking it is considered part of the attack action to fire the bow. Drawing a bolt and loading a crossbow, on the other hand, is more laborious and requires its own action. However, crossbows can be left loaded and ready to fire while traveling. Readying a bow or a crossbow which isn't in hand is an action. Elves can ready a bow, but not a crossbow, without taking an action due to their racial perks. Yura travels with her crossbow loaded, but it is currently attached to her mule's saddle. She uses her action to retrieve her crossbow from her mule and brings it up to bear in the direction of the bandit. Yura's player declares she's taking a headshot, then spends 3 stamina and uses her extra action to fire. Yura's player rolls 1d10 for a 10. Since that's a critical roll, she rolls a second d10 and gets a 4. The 10 and 4 are added to her dexterity of 6 and her crossbow skill of 6. The GM rules Yura is 10 meters away from the bandit, which is within close range for her weapon, so there's no range modifier. She receives a +1 bonus for her crossbow's innate weapon accuracy. She subtracts the -3 penalty for taking an extra action and another -6 for the headshot, for a total of 18. The bandit decides to try to straight out dodge Yura's bolt. The GM rolls 1d10 for a 2. That's added to the bandit's dexterity of 6 and dodge escape skill of 6, which is a total of 14. The bandit's defense check is less than Yura's attack check. Yura's player hits and rolls damage. The crossbow does 46 plus 2 damage. Yura rolls a total of 9. This was a called shot to the head, and the bandit isn't wearing a helmet, so doesn't subtract armor SP for the base damage. That's multiplied based on location, and headshots are times 3. Yura does a total of 27 points of damage to the bandit. That's more than enough. The GM rules the bandit is dead. Yura is worried about her brother's injuries, but they both realize they need to be sure they're safe before treatment can begin. They peer around, looking to make sure the bandit doesn't have any allies lurking nearby. The GM asks for an awareness skill check from each of them. Skill checks work essentially the same as attack and defense checks. To perform a skill check, the player or GM rolls 1d10, adds an attribute, adds a skill, and then adds or subtracts any bonuses or penalties based on circumstances such as lighting conditions, wounds, or not having the correct tools. The result of the roll is compared to a difficulty, also known as a DC. The GM sets the DC based on how difficult the task is. An easy task, such as knocking down a rotting door, has a DC of 10. An average task, such as sneaking past your standard town guard, has a DC of 14. A challenging task, such as picking a well-made lock, has a DC of 18. A difficult task, such as convincing the local burgermeister that you are not, in fact, the person whose face is drawn on that wanted poster over there, has a DC of 20. A nearly impossible task, such as forcing open a fortress gate barehanded, has a DC of 30. The DC can also be adjusted up or down based on circumstances. In the previously mentioned task of trying to pick a well-made lock, the GM decides it's not only one of excellent construction, but uses a tumbler technique that PC has never encountered before. The GM raises the DC from 18 to 19 to account for that. A skill check must roll higher than the DC in order to succeed. If it rolls equal to or lower than the DC, it fails. You can always try to make a skill check even if you don't have ranks in an appropriate skill. In doing so, your check is 1d10 plus the correct attribute, plus or minus any modifiers. You cannot make a skill check based on skills that are unique to a specific profession's skill tree. Just like in combat, rolls of 1 or 10 explode. If a 1 is rolled on the skill check, roll a second d10 and subtract it from the base to determine the final result. If a 10 is rolled, roll a second d10 and add the result of both dice to the base to determine the result. Again, as in combat, if a 10 is rolled on the second die, a third die is rolled and added or subtracted as circumstances dictate. This repeats until something other than a 10 is rolled. Unlike in combat, there is no equivalent to a fumble result table or a critical wounds table for normal skill checks. Yuri rolls 1d10 and gets a 6. He adds his intelligence of 5 and his awareness skill of 4 for a total of 15. Yura rolls 1d10 and gets a 4. She adds her intelligence of 8 but doesn't have the awareness skill, so her total is 12. The GM compares these two results to the DC of 14 and determines they've succeeded thanks to Yuri's higher roll. There are no other bandits around, but the twins do find this one's hidden stash, a pouch containing some cheap jewelry and 17 crowns, in a nearby bush. Now it's time for Yura to see to her brother's injuries. Yuri currently has 35 out of 45 health points and a sprained ankle, which is a simple critical wound. Yura grabs some supplies and tools from her mule and begins to treat her brother's sprained ankle. Critical wounds will not heal on their own. Instead, they require the aid of a doctor. They can also be treated via magic, which will be covered in a future video. Each critical wound has 3 levels of penalty, as listed on the critical wounds tables beginning on page 158. The first is the untreated effect, which is the penalty a character suffers when they take the wound. It lasts until the wound is stabilized or treated. Any character can attempt to stabilize a critical wound using the first aid skill. This represents efforts to mitigate the wound but doesn't actually begin healing it. The stabilization effect for a wound is less severe than the untreated effect, but it won't get any better without real attention. Only doctors and spellcasters who know healing magic can actually treat a critical wound. The treated effect is the least severe penalty the wounded can suffer, and treated wounds will heal entirely with time and rest. The only exception to this rule are deadly critical wounds. Those can be treated but will never fully heal. Deadly critical wounds mark a character for life. To stabilize a critical wound, a character must be able to work on the wound directly and make a first aid skill check against the DC listed on the Healing Hands table on page 174, which is based on the wound type. Simple critical wounds, for example, are easier to stabilize than difficult critical wounds. Stabilizing a critical wound can be done as a single action, and doctors can substitute their Healing Hands class ability for first aid when stabilizing a wound. There are times, such as in the middle of combat, when even a doctor might want to stabilize a wound rather than treat it. Stabilized wounds can be fully treated later. To treat a critical wound, a doctor must first spend multiple rounds performing a medical procedure on the patient, who must also be still during that time. When the procedure is done, the doctor makes a check using their Healing Hands profession skill against a DC. If they succeed, the wound is treated. If they fail, the wound remains untreated. The amount of time it takes and the DC for treating a critical wound depends on the severity of the wound. A simple critical wound requires 2 rounds of treatment and a Healing Hands roll against a DC of 12. A complex critical wound requires 4 rounds of treatment and a Healing Hands roll against a DC of 14. A difficult critical wound requires 6 rounds of treatment and a Healing Hands roll against a DC of 16. And a deadly critical wound requires 8 rounds of treatment and a Healing Hands roll against a DC of 18. Yuri's sprained ankle is a simple critical wound, which means Yura has to spend 2 rounds working on it and roll a Healing Hands check against a DC of 12 in order to treat it. She rolls 1d10 for a 5 and adds that to her craft of 9 and her Healing Hands of 6 for a total of 20. She succeeds, and Yuri's ankle is treated. Still, it's going to take time to fully heal and for his health points to replenish. Yuri insists they return to the nearby town and rest for a little bit. Grudgingly, Yuri agrees, but only after his sister helps him load the bandit's body onto the mule. There's sure to be a bounty to collect on the outlaw. Once they get back to town, they collect the bounty. A local shopkeeper owes them a favor and lets them use her store's back room as a place to rest for the duration of their stay, so Yuri can heal up. Recovering lost health points is a simple matter of resting. For every full day spent resting, a character recovers the number of health points equal to the recovery stat. If they do not rest, but instead engage in strenuous activities such as fighting or marching, for even part of the day, the character only heals half the recovery per day. Patients under the care of a doctor recover an extra 3 health points per day. To heal a critical wound, it must first be treated. A character must then rest a number of days based on the severity of the wound and their body, as indicated on the critical healing table on page 174. If this healing is interrupted by, say, a battle or going out to gather components, the timer doesn't start over, but the healing doesn't resume until the patient has gone back to resting. Except in the case of a deadly critical wound, when a wound is healed, all negative effects from it are gone. The treated effects of deadly critical wounds are permanent, but some can be mitigated through the use of prosthetics and training. Characters who are resting recover health points and heal from critical wounds at the same time. Yuri has a recovery of 7, and he's under a doctor's care, so he will heal all 10 of his lost health points with a day of rest. His body is 9, and his sprained ankle is a simple critical wound. Looking at the table on page 174, his player sees it will also take 1 day to heal his critical wound. 24 hours after returning to town, Yuri and Yura will be ready to set out on their journey once more. We hope you enjoyed this video. The Witcher Tabletop RPG and the contents of this video are copyright R. Talzorian Games. The Witcher is a registered trademark of CD Projekt SA, all rights reserved. You can purchase a digital copy of the Witcher Tabletop Roleplaying Game at DriveThruRPG. Physical copies of the book can be purchased from our web store and from your local game retailer. Please visit our blog for more information about the game and for links to our social media, including Twitter and Facebook. Thank you for watching, and please, keep your sword sharp.